So now we begin our examination of that very strained period in history known as Reconstruction in the state of Louisiana. Now, there are historians that believe that Reconstruction lasted until federal troops were withdrawn from the South. There are others who believe that Reconstruction came to an end with the civil rights bills of the 1960s. And there are those like myself that say that Reconstruction from the Civil War is an ongoing process that has not seen its final completion. When the Civil War was over, Louisiana had been devastated. The city of New Orleans had stayed intact because it had surrendered early in the war, but the rest of the state was incredibly destroyed by the war. Bridges burned, roads such as they were destroyed, levees broken. Louisiana needed to be rebuilt. And Reconstruction, by the name itself, suggests that there was a rebuilding going on, but there was a great deal of backlash. And then there was the introduction of the Republican Party in the South. There was some corruption and much good that went on in Reconstruction. Then there was white backlash. And then the end of Reconstruction, such as it was, the epitaph of Reconstruction, and finally the church and Reconstruction. Most historians will use the dates of 1866 to 1877 as the dates of Reconstruction. That is the period immediately following the Civil War, when federal troops were brought into the southern states after the war to keep the peace and politically guarantee the rights of African Americans in the South. It was the physical rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. Cities like Atlanta, Charleston, Memphis, Nashville, other southern cities were devastated, and they needed to be rebuilt. And then there was the reintegration of the southern states into the Union. Remember, they had left the Union, and now they needed to be brought back in. And how they would be brought back in was a point of contention. It saw the end of slavery and new labor regulations through the 13th Amendment, an attempt to reduce poverty, which was incredibly high in the South. Despite the wealth of the South, there was a high degree of poverty and a large gap between the rich and the poor. There was an unprecedented increase in black involvement in the political system. Then there was the 14th and the 15th Amendments guaranteeing due process, and the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the rights to vote for all men, the first mention of gender in the Constitution. We see new state constitutions that embrace the 14th and 15th Amendments. And the problems of Reconstruction, what were they? First, the death of President Lincoln, who may have been able to work the deal, and the inability of President Andrew Johnson to compromise with his political opponents, and radical Republican domination of Congress. These were those that saw the southern states' rebellion as an act of treason that needed to be punished. There was a harsh and punitive aspect to their Reconstruction policies. It brought on resentment that eventually resulted in the backlash of the Jim Crow era. And it then brought the return to dominance of white former Confederates. Now, New Orleans and other cities in Louisiana largely remained intact, but much of rural Louisiana was devastated and needed to be rebuilt. Now, Louisiana had surrendered early in the war, and Lincoln had put forth what was known as the 10% plan. That is, when 10% of ex-Confederates took a loyalty oath to the Union, the state was readmitted. And under the 10% plan, Louisiana wrote the Constitution of 1864, electing Michael Hahn as interim governor and then U.S. Senator, and James Madison Wells as lieutenant governor, who then went to the governorship when Hahn went to the Senate. And then Wells was reelected in 1865. But the first backlash occurred when many of the ex-Confederates were elected to the legislature, and many of the radical Republicans said that these were the guys that caused the secession and the Civil War in the first place. And then they turned around and started enacting new black codes, to which the radical Republicans said again, no, this is not what we fought the Civil War over. One of the big problems that came about in Louisiana and in the southern states was the convict lease system. For the convict lease system was the 13th Amendment's little caveat, little loophole in which people could actually be enslaved if they were convicted of a crime. And the convict lease system became worse than slavery because there was no sense of investment in the person. And there was selective enforcement of the laws that usually favored whites and sent blacks to prison. There was corruption, a lack of accountability, racial violence. And radical Republicans then decided enough is enough is enough to curtail the efforts of the ex-Confederates. And during this time, the Republican Party, which remember had only been founded in 1854 and had been largely reserved to the northern states, now entered the South. Mostly free men of color and former slaves made up the Republican Party. They lobbied strong for the right to vote for African Americans. This was their base. In 1866, in both New Orleans and Memphis, there were riots in which numerous pro-Union whites and African Americans were killed. And Congress then took over Reconstruction from the president, who had been running Reconstruction at this point. The new Reconstruction legislation, like the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, would bring the nation to the point of another major constitutional crisis and pit the executive branch against the Congress. These acts were passed over Andrew Johnson's veto, and it divided the South into 5 military districts. General Winfield Scott Hancock, whom you see in the picture to the right, one of the heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg, became the military governor of the Louisiana district. Under the Reconstruction Acts, all black males were given the right to vote. Most white males who were ex-Confederates, that is, did they serve in the state legislatures, the Confederate legislature, or did they serve at rank of colonel or above, were disenfranchised. And so, as a result of this, many whites spent the majority of their time plotting their return to power and reaffirming white superiority. Reconstruction had its problems, but it did a great deal of good. Louisiana was readmitted to the Union when it rewrote its Constitution in 1868, and it elected Henry Clay Warmoth, the governor of Louisiana, who was a Republican, a member of the Customs House gang. Henry Clay Warmoth was no egalitarian and was no believer in the equality of black people. He was a virulent racist, a member of the Customs House gang, and he is one of those Northerners that came south to Louisiana as a Republican on the make. He was looking to make money. He was looking for a chance to make a political name for himself. He was a very corrupt individual. His lieutenant governor was Oscar J. Dunn, who you see here, an African American, a very strong opponent of Warmoth. He died early in office, and he was replaced by PBS Pinchback, who would eventually become the first governor of Louisiana, who was an African American, first governor of a state who was an African American. Under the Republican Reconstruction government, which was enforced at the point of Union soldiers and their weapons, African Americans advanced. They opened schools, integrated theaters, public places, founded a newspaper, the New Orleans Tribune. They set up a returning board to guarantee fair elections in white majority parishes. But like I said, Warmoth was corrupt and he had a very weak record on civil rights. There was a property tax increase on white landowners, and the first Louisiana lottery was chartered in 1868, which instituted a new period of corruption in Louisiana politics. What you see here is the composite of all the African Americans elected to the state legislature with Oscar J. Dunn in the center. Because of the advancement of African Americans, there was a great deal of white backlash. The Knights of the White Camellia, a Ku Klux Klan style of organization, along with the Klan and the urban-centered White League, who did not mask themselves, openly defied Reconstruction. The unification movement was founded on the basis that Negro political power was a reality and might as well be accepted. It advocated complete political equality for the Negro, an equal division of state offices between the races, and a plan whereby Negroes would become landowners. It denounced discrimination because of color in hiring laborers or in selecting directors of corporations, and called for the abandonment of segregation in public conveyances, public places, railroads, steamboats, and public schools. And the person that put all this together was none other than former Confederate Civil War General P.G.T. Beauregard, who was the Resolutions Committee chairman. When Dunn died, he was succeeded by Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who was the first African-American governor of Louisiana. He served for 35 days because Henry Clay Warmoth was impeached in December near the end of his term. In 1873, on April the 13th, 100 African Americans were killed in a dispute over voting rights with the White League in Colfax, Louisiana. And the White League specialized in intimidating Republican politicians. There was a massacre at Coushatta, which is near Lake Charles. This brought federal troops back into Louisiana. There was also the Metropolitan Police Force, a constabulary that was designed to control the White League. And then there was also the unification movement. In New Orleans, the Battle of Liberty Square at the foot of Canal Street on September the 14th, 1874, came between the Metropolitan Police and the Black Militia against the White League. The White League was winning the battle until federal troops were called into New Orleans to squelch the rebellion. In honor of the men of the White League, they erected the famous or infamous Liberty Monument at the foot of Canal Street, which in the 1980s was then moved over behind Canal Place, and then last year, of course, was taken down by the Landrieu administration and now sits in a warehouse somewhere in the city, generating a great deal of controversy, even though the monument was adjusted to include all members of the Metropolitan Police as well who lost their lives there. The obelisk was put there as a memorial to the ending of Reconstruction in New Orleans, because this signaled the beginning of the end. The epitaph of Reconstruction, when the soldiers went home, is that true public education began in Louisiana at long last, and also black higher education. Dillard University came about, Southern University, in which Pinchback was a member of the Board of Trustees. Yet another constitution was written in 1879 that overturned most Reconstruction policies. The capital was moved back to Baton Rouge. Taxes were greatly reduced, mostly for white landowners. But you did see the growth of American religious congregations and the wage labor system, and of course, sharecropping. Sharecropping is a tenant farm system in which the person is allowed portion of the lands on which they used to work as a slave, but they can't be paid a wage by the master because there was no capital in the South. So instead, they were allowed to work the land for a portion of the crops, which sounds great on paper. However, with the market for cotton being what it is, with the problems of the boll weevil and things like that that would eat the crop, many of these individuals will go into serious debt, and that would be just as bad as slavery. But sharecropping was nonetheless preferred by most African Americans because they were at least masters on their own land. In 1876, Louisiana held its gubernatorial election, featuring Packard versus Nichols for governor and Samuel Tilden of New York versus Rutherford Hayes of Ohio for president. There was a great deal of voter intimidation by the White League, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the Klan. Hayes won the presidency despite losing the popular vote. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? But Hayes promised to remove federal troops from the South, and this allowed Florida to give its electoral votes to Hayes. Nichols and Packard in Louisiana both took the oath of office as governor, but eventually the state returning board affirmed Samuel T.U. Nichols as governor of Louisiana. The legacy of Reconstruction amounted to bitterness and resentment from whites, increased poverty and alienation of blacks, especially in the sharecropping sphere. There was increased political corruption, especially in Louisiana. And eventually, white ex-Confederates were restored to office. And this, of course, began the birth of virulent racism, white supremacy that would eventually result in Jim Crow laws would rise up throughout the South. The church in Reconstruction, the church had to deal with the incorporation of newly released African Americans and education for the black population. The Sisters of the Holy Family became the main resource for black education, being an order of African American nuns. They also had to deal with a growing Indian Catholic population. The new Archbishop of New Orleans, Archbishop Pish, expanded parishes in the archdiocese, increased Catholic education, and invited new religious communities to New Orleans, especially the Poor Clares, who are a member of the Franciscan order, and the Brothers of the Sacred Heart, who currently staff schools such as Brother Martin High School and St. Stanislaus in Mississippi. The Catholic press maintained a strong circulation in the Morning Star for English-speaking Catholics. Father Abram Ryan served as the priest poet of the Confederacy. Mary Louise Points was a woman editor of the Morning Star. The church suffered from epidemics such as yellow fever, which was carried by the mosquito. Neither the clergy nor the nuns were immune, such as Father Francis Xavier Seeloss, who came to New Orleans for just 1 year and then died in the yellow fever epidemic, and Father Leonard Thevis, who served many of the Cajuns, died in the yellow fever epidemic. He prayed to St. Roch to spare his parishioners at Holy Trinity from yellow fever. And so not one of them died, and he built a shrine to St. Roch here in New Orleans, and then he himself died later on. Louisiana life during Reconstruction was not all bad, was not all negative. Street railways increased in New Orleans. Jean Lejeune, Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, after whom Camp Lejeune, North Carolina is named. In 1867, he was born. St. John the Baptist Church, the church with the golden steeple next to the Mississippi River Bridge, was built. Charles Buddy Bolden was born. Pierre Landry, a free man of color, was elected mayor of Donaldsonville and later established an academy in uptown New Orleans. New Orleans annexed Algiers Point, and Jefferson City in 1870, moving to the southeast and to the west. The state purchased the Fuchsia Plantation, eventually becoming Audubon Park in 1871. The Mississippi cut a crevice to Lake Pontchartrain through the Bonnet Carré Swamp, which eventually resulted in the Bonnet Carré Spillway that the Corps of Engineers would build. In 1872, Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich came to New Orleans, and the elites of New Orleans decided to throw for him a very nice royal-style ball. And out of this came the Rex organization, the crew of Rex, the king of Carnival. The New Orleans Athletic Club was formed. The town of Carrollton joined the city of New Orleans. The Carrollton City Hall and Courthouse is still there, where the streetcar turns onto St. Charles from Carrollton from St. Charles. And in 1879, the French Quarter enters the nation's consciousness as a place of charm and romance. Mary Evelyn Moore Davis portrayed the Ville Carré in Harper's Magazine and made the French Quarter the site of a late 19th century literary movement. Three leaders of the Archdiocese. Napoleon Joseph Pache left, was the editor of Le Propagateur Catholique. He ran afoul of Benjamin Butler in New Orleans. His successor, Francis Xavier Leray, center left, came to America as a seminarian and to New Orleans from Natchez. He struggled to run an archdiocese very deep in debt because of the Civil War. The large picture on the right is that of Francis Xavier Seeloss, a German Redemptorist who died of yellow fever in 1867 after being in New Orleans for only a year. His dedication to the victims of the epidemic and his patient suffering while inflicted with the disease proved to be a model of spirit to all the people in the Archdiocese. His national shrine is located in the rear of St. Mary's Assumption Church in the Irish Channel. The poet-priest of the South. Like many priests, Father Abram Ryan abhorred slavery, but viewed the behavior of the Union with contempt. He wrote The Conquered Banner and became editor of the Catholic newspaper, The Morning Star.